Hello everybody and welcome back to another installment from our series Straight from the Horse's Mouth. Today's webinar centers around greener packaging solutions with life cycle assessment and how an LCA can be used to inform business decision making. Here's a sneak preview.
Not that we think that there's anything wrong with the compostable bag technology, it's just that I guess we feel that, in my own words, we feel that compostable packaging is an unfulfilled promise, and we decided that it's important for us to go with an LCA because it's difficult to convey the complex decision-making process.
What we found was that paper trumps recycled plastic or any form of plastic in terms of its contribution to the circular economy. The kind of current flavor of the moment, which is to phase plastics out in every single situation because plastics are quote unquote evil, I think is a little bit limiting. I think you need to look at the plastics and go, okay, is there a risk that this plastic is going to end up in the environment or not? And if there's very low risk that the plastic will end up in the environment, then maybe that's not the kind of plastic you need to focus on first to substitute.
What I liked about this webinar is how Ronald takes us through New Zealand Post's motivation for undertaking a comparative LCA, as well as some of the surprises there were along the way. However, what were they? Let's find out.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Vickers, and welcome to today's webinar, Greener Packaging Solutions with Life Cycle Assessment, which is part of our webinar series, Straight from the Horse's Mouth, Insights from Experts in 30 Minutes. Today, we're going to be discussing how life cycle assessment can be used to inform business decision-making and specifically decisions involving packaging. I'm delighted today to welcome my co-speaker, Ronald Liew from New Zealand Post. Ronald is a product manager where he's been looking after the retail parcels business. He was previously a product manager at IAG and Sleepyhead. Ronald's an aspiring chef, a wine enthusiast, and a martial arts specialist. And it's this latter kind of skill of his that I insisted on doing a virtual webinar today. I didn't really want to be in the same room with him. Also, it looks pretty close quarters where he is calling in from New Zealand Post. Ronald's going to take us through New Zealand Post's motivation for why they did this life cycle assessment study, and specifically a comparison looking at different courier bag options. And then I'm going to get a little bit into the detail looking at the results and kind of what they mean. So with that in mind, I'll hand over to Ronald, who'll take us through his presentation. So over to you, Ronald.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. So New Zealand Post was established in 1930s, and sustainability is a big deal here at New Zealand Post. For a company that's been around for 175 years, you can say that it's in our DNA. New Zealand Post is signed up to the New Zealand Packaging Declaration, and that means that we're committed to using 100% reusable, recyclable, or compostable packaging by 2025. To the team that's been charged with delivering this, what that means is we want to bring genuine good as we go about this, genuine good for the environment, and not bring about unintended negative consequences. And what that means is that we won't be, moving sand around, or specifically, we won't be greenwashing. To the team that's been tasked with bringing this about, they set out earnestly to achieve this goal of bringing about sustainable packaging at New Zealand Post for about 3 years before I joined. And prior to that, they got really close to launching a compostable bag, and in fact, we went as far as going for an RFP. And we shelved that decision just prior to me joining, because there's been other studies that came out that highlighted the challenges that's got to do with compostable. That's just caused the team to, I guess, pump the brakes and slow down and think about this a little bit more before introducing this range. And I just want to be very clear, it's not that we think that there's anything wrong with the compostable bag technology. It's just that I guess we feel that, in my own words, we feel that compostable packaging is an unfulfilled promise. Perfect. The technology and the product is great. We just think that the promise doesn't quite meet reality, and we can talk about that a little bit more later on. So for New Zealand Post, the pressure really came on in July of 2019 with the Plastic Free July challenge, and and at that point, social media just blew up, and that's when we got a lot of challenges from our customer group. We've been called out, customers have lost patience with this, and just a couple of highlighted remarks here. As you can see, lots of people asking for paper, compostable, saying it's taking too long. And that's when we felt that, having earnestly tried to bring this about for 3 years, it's about time we showed some progress. And the best solution to us at the time was to bring about paper-based bags to replace our plastic bubble bags. So these bags are 100% made from recycled paper, and they are 100% recyclable by your curbside recycling, and they're also, as paper is, compostable. We were really excited to launch these products when New Zealand went into level 4 lockdown in March. The decision at New Zealand Post to transition ourselves away from virgin plastic bags to recycle plastic bags came in early 2020. And that was informed by our conversations with Liew, who is our supplier, as well as informal chats and comments from the expert community, such as Sustainable Business Network. And as well as the internal wealth of knowledge that's been accumulated throughout the years and sentiments around various packaging types, which we all privately hold, right? And we decided that it's important for us to go with an LCA because it's difficult to convey the complex decision-making process. And in weighing up the various pros and cons, it's difficult precisely because it's a combination of hard and soft facts, right? We needed a document that we could reference and talk through the rationale in an objective way, because I'm not sure about you guys, but we found ourselves basically going around in circles thinking that we're making progress, which this diagram I find perfectly illustrates that. You think you're making progress just to find yourself back at the very start. We also decided to make the LCA report publicly available, as it aligns with our ethos of that hoarding knowledge is not how leaders behave. Expectations were that pros and cons were going to be fairly equal, and that we can guide the conversations as to why we ended up choosing recycled plastic instead of compostable. And never did we expect that recycled plastic to be such a superstar. And that's kind of what that pencil drawing of Neil deGrasse is about. We also didn't expect the paper packaging to have the challenges that it does. We were very fortunate through the LCA process that our supplier, Liew, are already very practiced at LCAs, and they were very willing to share information. To the point where we, New Zealand Post, didn't have to do very much. Liew and thinkstep did most of the talking. And where we, New Zealand Post, provided input was around the scope of the study, as well as the comparative points we thought were important to make. We thought that the point of the LCA is to be a reference to answer questions that we were expecting to be asked. And you can say that it's our bad attitude, right? I really like the idea of this, that we do the work so that we can stand behind the decisions that we make. As great as the LCA has been in helping us make our decisions, the LCAs obviously have its limits. And at the moment, there are no good indicators for measuring marine plastic pollution, which is ultimately the concern around plastic. It can only be inferred qualitatively through all the different information sources that we've got. The ultimate point, I guess, I'm trying to make with this is that we as decision makers need to take on the responsibility of making the decisions. And as much as we like to look at scientific means and outcomes and be guided by that, we can't abdicate our responsibility for the decision making. Some decisions are just hard to make. And until, I guess, the science and the technology allows us to make decisions easily, we have to take some responsibilities in our own decision making and not just defer that away. And just want to be very clear that the LCA has been great in helping us make our decisions, but it's not a silver bullet to your sustainable packaging conundrums. And with that, Jeff, thank you very much, and I pass it back on to you.
I'm going to talk next a little bit about the results, but before that, I wanted to talk a bit more about kind of the context and why the sort of plastics issue has become so important and how it sits with other issues kind of in society. So many of you in the New Zealand scene will know Colmar Brunton's annual Better Futures report, and this report comes out each year ranking the top sustainability concerns for New Zealanders. And there are similar surveys done by Kantar, Colmar Brunton's parent organisation, and other markets, which I'll talk about in a second. But this kind of highlights the 2021 survey, which was actually conducted back in December 2020. And what it sort of shows is that of New Zealanders' top sustainability concerns, there are 3 that are related to the environment, And all three of them are really related around packaging, waste, and plastics. So climate change doesn't feature here, for example, but what you do see is, number 6 being built up of plastics in the environment, number 7 around not enough waste being recycled, and number 10 about over packaging, non-recyclable packaging in landfill. Interestingly, the plastics one is one that's actually slipped quite a few places over the years. It started out number 1, maybe back in, I think it was 2018. There were some great sort of documentaries going around at that time, making that a real issue for society. And, as a result, it got really bumped up to the top of the survey above all other sort of sustainability issues for New Zealand, including, suicide, cost of living, other sort of child poverty issues and other things which are incredibly important in the New Zealand context. And so I kind of feel like it went up a bit too high at the start, and now it's kind of settling back down towards perhaps a more realistic placing, but it's still interesting to see how high up it is in the scale. If you look at the trends over time, and again, I'm going to draw on Conrad Brunton's very good storytelling ability and draw on a couple of the slides here before I get into the results. What you can see is that the sort of sustainability awakening happened around a similar time that sort of awareness of plastics happened. So, there was a sort of bubbling beneath the surface. It's an important issue for New Zealanders, but it really peaked around 2018 and then it's kind of fallen off a little bit with COVID, but building up a little bit again, as you can see. Interestingly, the reverse can kind of be seen with climate change. It built up to a peak about the same sort of time around 2018, and then interest has really kind of fallen away in the New Zealand context, particularly through COVID, where it really fell off a cliff. And if you look at kind of the reasons why, so Conrad Brunton dug into the reasons why, they think, people realize that climate change is important, but they just felt that there were more immediate threats to society with the COVID pandemic, for example. So, the potential economic consequences of that, the sort of short to medium term influences of that versus a slightly longer term perspective around climate change, despite the fact that science tells us we need to act now. If you look at how we compare to other countries, you can see that there are some reasonable differences. So in the Australian context here in the middle, you can see, it's highlighted here in orange, biodiversity comes in at number 2. And in the UK, biodiversity comes in at number 3, whereas in the New Zealand context, it's second from the bottom. Other ones that favour here, in the Australian context, extreme weather, and also in the UK, extreme weather. I guess climate change doesn't necessarily have the burning platform that bushfires have in terms of literally a burning platform. And so you've got sort of differences in priority, but you've also got some sort of differences based on kind of context in each different market. But you do see some quite important differences here from New Zealand versus other markets, though you do see in the UK context, ocean plastics being right at the top. And I guess we have David Attenborough to thank for a lot of that kind of stuff and some of his persuasiveness of how he presents. Yet climate change is something else he talks about in a lot of detail, and it doesn't quite feature quite as highly. The encouraging news, I think, is that businesses are communicating more clearly. So this is confusion levels dropping. So the confusion level around business communication is decreasing. People are finding that business communication around sustainability is getting better. And I hope that this study can be part of that trend. In terms of the context of where this all sits, many of you will be well aware of the new plastic economy commitments from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and the corresponding New Zealand plastic packaging declaration that Ronald mentioned. These 2025 targets have all plastic packaging 100% reusable, recyclable, or compostable. So in the context of New Zealand Post study, what we were doing was looking at a range of different one-way packaging options, one-way courier bags. We weren't considering reusable packaging in this context deliberately, because it's an important step, but it's one that potentially needs to be taken later until the economics and the reverse logistics and things can be worked through. So that's something New Zealand Post are considering, but it wasn't something that we could consider right now as a kind of off-the-shelf, ready-to-go solution. So as Ronald mentioned, we worked closely with New Zealand Post supplier CLDN to look at all of the different packaging options they could consider. So New Zealand made recycled plastic bags, which were a new product they were introducing. Chinese made recycled plastic bags, home compostable courier bags, virgin craft paper bags, and then craft paper bags with a recycled newspaper padding inside them. So the later one, this final one, was actually sort of slightly different to the others in that it wasn't a flat bag. But the reason for including it is that from a kind of soft perspective, New Zealand Post felt that the padded paper bag behaved and felt more like a conventional plastic courier bag, whereas the craft paper flat bag felt more like an envelope, and so therefore didn't quite feel the same as the other products it was replacing. So we included both in scope just to kind of see the difference between them. And what we did is we looked at all of the different packaging layers. So we looked at the bag itself, the bags come in, and the boxes, the bags come in. So we looked at all those different layers. We looked at the pallets, the bags of boxes of bags were on the pallets getting to the different stores where they were being sold or distributed. We looked at a range of different environmental indicators, 14 in total, and of those we took 3 headline environmental indicators. Climate change, so global warming potential or carbon footprint was the top one, the main one we looked at. We also looked at material circularity, which is the ability of the plastic or the product, to contribute to a circular economy. And the reason why that's particularly important in this context is that focus on waste, on recycling, on plastics in the environment and that kind of thing. We also looked at toxicity because that's a key concern for New Zealand Post's customers. And we used a wide range of other environmental indicators to check if our conclusions changed compared to those 3 headline indicators. And so through that process, we considered the entire life cycle of the packaging from what we call cradle to grave or cradle to cradle, where you look at the production of the raw materials, the manufacturing of the bag, the transport to New Zealand Post, the transport of the goods in the bag through New Zealand Post network, but specifically the transport impacts associated with the bag itself. And then finally, how the bag reaches its end of life. Is it recycled? Does it go to landfill? Or in the case of the home compostable bag, is it home composted? And what we found was that paper trumps recycled plastic or any form of plastic in terms of its contribution to the circular economy. So paper is more circular, but recycled plastic trumped paper across all of the other 13 indicators we assessed. And so if you look at that in the context of climate change, what you can see here, if you look at this chart, is you'll see the baseline line, that sort of light gray line on the left-hand side. And what you can see is that the original bag, which is sort of off the table in terms of options, but included for point of comparison, is where this sort of gray bar in the background sits. And you can see the different options we assessed coming down here. You can see the different end-of-life options as these bars at the end of the chart. So there's an orange bar to indicate landfill and a greeny kind of colored bar looking to indicate the recycling or home composting. And what you can see is that the impact of the locally recycled plastic bag, it has less than half of the impact of the original bag. The Chinese recycled courier bag also has a considerably lesser impact than the original bag. And then all of the other bags, the home compostable, the flat craft paper bag, and the padded craft paper bag, all have a higher impact. I should emphasize that these products are as sourced through New Zealand Post supply chain, particularly with Sealed Air. So it was their particular supply chain we were looking at. And so this is Australian-made paper. I think the home compostable bags might have been made in China. I need to double check that. The original bags, and then New Zealand made or Chinese made recycled courier bags. So this is a specific supply chain, and I should emphasize that different supply chains, even for the same material types, might give you different results. And it's particularly noticeable for the paper, given that there's a wide variation in the impact of paper making. And in the case of home compostables, you can get differences in material composition, and that would affect this blue bar in particular. But what you can clearly see here from looking at this is that it's really only the recycled plastic bags that would offer a lesser impact or lesser carbon footprint than the original bag. And compared to the other options that are on the table, it's a significant saving, yet a lot of the others were significantly worse. So this is the number of times worse it was. So what you can see for the home compostable, even before you take it to end of life, it's already twice as bad as the entire life cycle emissions, including end of life of the original courier bag. And once you factor in end of life, be that composting or landfill, you end up with something that's sort of 2.5 to 3 times worse. For the paper bags, you're looking anywhere between, depending on how you deal with it, 5 to 13 times higher carbon footprint than the original bag that was being replaced. And so it just gives you some idea of the kind of scale of the difference that Ronald was referring to earlier. And so I mentioned before that we looked at a wide range of different indicators. And so in this context, we looked at human toxicity, acidification, eutrophication, a whole bunch of other scary sounding things that are, sort of scary LCA terms for things that can affect the environment. And it doesn't really matter too much what all these things mean in the context of this presentation. What's more important is just to kind of understand the degree of difference that we're talking about. So in these charts, in this sort of heat map kind of style of presentation, 100% represents the impact of the virgin bag. So anything less than 100% is an improvement, and anything more than 100% is a worsening in impact. And so what you can see is the New Zealand recycled bag is significantly less than 100% in all cases, apart from for the non-hazardous waste disposed, where it's marginally worse, 5% worse, and it's uses marginally higher net use of fresh water, which you can see at 34% more. than the virgin bag. And incidentally, that's largely because of the New Zealand electricity mix used to recycle the bag, which uses hydropower, and therefore there's a bit of water consumption involved. But what you can see here is that looking at this as a kind of traffic light system, it's basically green across the board with a little bit of orange and one bit of red. And the bit of red that you can see there is actually, that's just a metric for how much water is consumed. The most important metric is actually water scarcity footprint. So how impactful the use of that water is related to the scarcity in the area where it occurs. And from a water scarcity perspective, it's actually a significant improvement compared to the previous internationally made virgin bag. And so even though it uses a bit more water, it uses it in the New Zealand context where it's a bit less important, if that makes sense. And from the perspective of waste, yes, it produces a little bit more, but also there's a kind of a saving in waste as well through reusing sort of material that would have previously gone into the waste stream, which isn't fully accounted for there because there's the way that the accounting works. And what you can see here as well, if you look at the other products, you're seeing significant worsening, things that are 10 times worse, or more in some cases. This is 600% worse. It's there's a significant increase in impact across some of the other indicators that we're looking at here. So what that indicates is pretty serious trade-offs, and it's not just for climate change. It's also across a wide range of other indicators. There's a whole lot of red here. The very last line is the material circularity indicator. And what that means, for those of you who haven't seen it before, is a 1 means a perfectly circular system, and a 0 means a system that's perfectly linear. And so a 0.2 isn't a wonderful score, but if you look across the table here, none of these scores are particularly wonderful. And it's just because of the nature of a one-way product. You can do so much, but there's only so much you can do. And so this product is better than the previous virgin bag, which is why it gets a score here of why it gets a green traffic light, but it is a bit worse than the paper you can see on the right there in terms of the recycled newspaper padded bag option. So that just gives you a bit of a flavor of the trade-off analysis, but by and large, you've got a product here that is more or less green across the board, which is always a really great place to be. So in terms of what the outcome was, you can already see these products on the shelf if you're a consumer in New Zealand. You can now see this little thing here, which says made with 80% recycled plastic. So these products are already in the market. And I understand New Zealand Post is rolling them out to its commercial customers throughout the course of this year. So I just want to thank, again, New Zealand Post to commission the study, CLD, who provided the data. And I want to also flag that for a study like this, where you're making comparisons, you do have to go through quite a rigorous process following a standard called ISO 14044 and another standard ISO 14067. And that requires us to have a review by a panel of 3 experts. So this is our lovely review panel here. I thank them for their feedback. And all of that can be found if you want to look into this in more detail on either New Zealand Post website or our website. The full report's available, as well as summary versions of it in case you're interested. And that's a sort of mandatory requirement to comply with those ISO standards. So with that in mind, I'd like to say thank you and open the floor to questions. And I can see that a couple have already come through. So the first one here was from Adam, who asks, did you consider bio-based plastics, for example, Breastchem LDPE? And so the short answer to that question is not initially, although more recently, New Zealand Post asked us to do a little bit of a back of the envelope calculation to sort of quantify that and provide that separately to the study scope. The Breastchem LDPE does have some benefits. As many of you may be aware, they claim a negative carbon footprint because of the way the land use happens upstream and the fact it's a bio-derived plastic. And it's fully recyclable at end of life because it's chemically identical to regular low density polyethylene. It wasn't in scope. It does have potentially carbon footprint benefits depending on supply chain, but it can have other trade-offs and other environmental indicators. So particularly for things like eutrophication, which measures nutrient loading, the Breastchem product is produced as a result of, I think it's from sugarcane bagasse, so the waste residues from sugarcane production in Brazil. And as a result, you do have the sugarcane growing upstream impacts partly associated with that. And so there are some trade-offs there regarding the use of the land and the nutrient use in land and the runoff from that and all of those sorts of things. And so it has benefits potentially from a climate change perspective, but there are other trade-offs to be aware of that you wouldn't see through a product like recycled plastic. Next question was from a different Adam. Just to confirm, the recycled plastic bag had half the greenhouse gas emissions of the paper version. If we go back, it's actually considerably more than that. So here's the change here. The recycled plastic bag had less than half the emissions of the original virgin plastic bag. But if you compare it to the paper bags here, which is sort of 5 to 13 times more than the original, and this one's half as good, again, you're talking about differences of between 10, 20, 30 times improvement. Next question is from Sophie, which is, why does the home compostable contribute to carbon footprint more than recycling? Is this the same for industrial composting? Is this just the product supply chain? Generally, home composting contributes more to carbon footprint than recycling. So in the case of the home compostable, what you're seeing here is the difference between landfill and composting, whereas these ones are the difference between landfill and recycling. The reason why home composting contributes to carbon emissions is because, and this is something that we kind of work through the study, home compostable bags are typically made from a plastic that's actually fossil derived. And so even though it's home compostable, it actually comes from an oil derived source. And so when that plastic degrades, it actually releases the fossil carbon to the atmosphere. So you'll get bags that say they're made from cornstarch and things. And those bags actually have a cornstarch filler. And the filler might be, say, 40% cornstarch. The rest of the bag, 50% or more of it typically, is made from a plasticky stuff that holds the filler together. And that plasticky stuff for home compostable is typically actually oil derived. It's different when you get to industrial compostable plastics like PLA, for example, which is bio-based and biodegradable. And in that context, you wouldn't see the same type of emission. But this is effectively because of the fact that the home compostable bag is partly fossil-based and being released. And so that's a bit of a catch for people who are considering those bag types. And in the context of landfill, you see even higher emissions because that fossil carbon is being released partly as methane. And so you've got even higher kind of fossil emission to the atmosphere than if you were to compost it at home. I wondered, is this study helping you to sort of change the way you communicate with your stakeholders? How is it helping you with how you communicate with stakeholders?
Yeah, so we're just starting to put together, I guess, a pack which we can take forward to our stakeholders. And obviously our stakeholders are not just our business customers, but also our end user of the general public, right? So in terms of the information that we have put together for the general public, it's available on our website, so newzealandpost.com/sustainability, and you should be able to navigate your way through to this LCA study. But in terms of how else we're using it to engage with our stakeholders, I guess we're using it to indicate, I suppose, a few things. First of all, the most obvious thing: why have we gone from plastic to plastic? And secondly, I suppose, is dispel some of the myths that people had going into this. As I mentioned before, referencing Neil deGrasse again, with the bad attitude, the work has been done to clearly indicate what the science tells us and what we know about the trade-offs when it comes to the different materials. And we're using that information, I suppose, to educate our various stakeholders that, that they may have a preconception as to, for example, compostable being better for the environment.
Find that those trade-offs are something that you can discuss with customers, business customers in particular. Do they understand that? Are they interested in that kind of information, or is the messaging too complicated?
No. I mean, a lot of businesses have already gone down in earnest and have a lot, I suppose, of background knowledge and research themselves. And I suppose they found themselves in a very similar position as we were in, with the Escher painting before, where you find yourself going around in circles and not being able to really make a decision because it's difficult to frame, I guess, the trade-offs and the pros and cons, and the slide that you had showing the different environmental indicators and with the traffic light system, that's a very powerful visual to help people make a decision. It's not obvious, right? If you think about it, your intuition tells you that going from plastic to plastic just doesn't feel right. But when you're confronted with facts, with this chart here, you go, oh, maybe there is an inbuilt bias towards plastic. Maybe I need to rethink the way I think about plastic and what the science and the facts tells us about what the pros and cons are. I mean, these are significant considerations for the environment if you get it wrong, and especially at our scale where we put out a lot of packaging. We got to get this right.
One of the things we often advise our clients is to take a risk-based approach when it comes to packaging and plastics in particular, because the thing is that plastics are only really a problem when they're in the environment, right? Like plastics are intended not to biodegrade. That's the kind of whole idea. They're intended to hold together, to be durable, things that last for a long time. And so the non-biodegradability of plastics is kind of built in. That's part of why they're desirable. And so, the kind of current flavor of the moment, which is to phase plastics out in every single situation because plastics are quote unquote evil, I think is a little bit limiting. I think you need to look at the plastics and go, okay, is there a risk that this plastic is going to end up in the environment or not? And if there's very low risk that the plastic will end up in the environment, then maybe that's not the kind of plastic you need to focus on first to substitute. Because really it's, if there's no risk of it ending up in the environment, then is it a problem that it's plastic? You can provide schemes to recycle soft plastics, you can take them back, you can do all kinds of things. So it's not that they're unrecyclable. You can definitely recycle rigid plastics. We're doing both, flexible and rigid. In New Zealand, okay, it could be done better, same in Australia, but it's this kind of risk question for us. And so I think when you're looking at a product, my advice would always be, is there a risk of it entering the environment? And if the answer to that question is no, then is it actually a problem if it's a plastic? And in the context of a courier bag, you're talking about something that's a door-to-door product, right? It's going from someone's house to someone else's house, or someone's business to someone else's business, or whatever. And it's ending up, they're taking it inside and they're having to deal with it. They unwrap the thing and they have to dispose of it, whether that disposal is landfill, where it ends up in a hole in the ground and is contained, or whether it ends up going to soft plastics recycling and gets made into something else. Either way, it's not ending up in the environment. So what's the risk of a courier bag ending up in the environment? There is some risk, but it's very low. And I would say it's nowhere near as high as like an on-the-go product, like a small drink bottle or ice cream wrapper or something like that, where you're taking it out and eating it out and about in the park or whatever. And then even if you do choose to put it in the bin, it might be blown about by the wind and end up in the environment, for example. And so I think it's a case of taking context into account and not just saying plastics are evil, but rather looking at how is the plastic used and what's the risk. Anything you want to add before we wrap up?
No, yeah, I thank you for bringing the points that you just did up, and I guess it kind of plays nicely to the comment that I made before about taking responsibility around sustainable packaging and not abdicate that responsibility to something else, right? Be it the science, be it government policy, be it whatever it is. I suppose we at New Zealand Post understand the impact we have as a result of our decisions. And again, you've still got that table up, which is great. So imagine if we make the wrong choice and we're not diligent enough in our decision making. And because of the scale that we have, if we went with something like a compostable product, that will be the damage multiplied by our scale, right? So our responsibility is to do the work, and for us and the scale that we've got and the challenges that we face and our customers face and our users face means that recycled plastic is a sensible choice for us to not only limit the environmental harm, but do as much good as we possibly can. And that is as much as we can do. If we could enter your home and take the used courier bag and pop it into a soft plastic recycling scheme, we would definitely entertain that, but I guess we can't. So I guess my what I like to encourage our audience to do is to, I guess, do your part and recycle it where you can, where you have access to soft plastic recycling, because these bags are recyclable as much as they are being made from recycled plastic. And of course, this is this doesn't end here. This doesn't end at 2025. We're continuing to explore different options. I guess Nirvana state at the moment that we are trying to pursue is to have a fully closed loop system, and that starts with people developing the habit of bringing their used courier bags back into the system, into the soft plastic recycling scheme, so that we have a way, I guess, to divert that. And yeah, that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Ronald. Right, well, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for everyone for dialing in. Really appreciated your input and your thoughts there, Ronald. So thank you very much. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Cheers. Bye.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. See you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.